Yes, that's right. You've asked for it, and I'm doing it. Roland Hartman made some great animations showing off new features in Trapcode Particular, including built-in ground planes, children inheriting parent properties, and other things. But the one that everyone asked for a tutorial for was this one, Dancer Falling to Dust. Now you can do other things with the physics, make the things fly everywhere, and you can even put it inside of a video and use the video to drive the reflection. But we're going to do this tutorial more like the way he did it. We're going to put him in a photo, and we're going to do it just like this. So come on. Now we could use a lovely dance animation like this, which is similar to the one in the original example, but I decided I wanted to go something a little more flair. So we've got our little can here, and I want to say that we're going to be emitting from the polygons of the image, the faces as Particular calls them, and there's a bunch up here in the hair area, so I don't particularly want to include that. Happily, there's a pre-made selection for the hair already here on this model, so I can just delete it, and I really don't need this texture or that selection tag anymore. And so now, all you have to do when you have your animation ready to go in Cinema 4D is you hit File, Export, go down to Wavefront OBJ, and hit this little settings button. Then there'll be presets, geometry, material, like all these things will be up and possibly available for you. Important one for us is the animation. We don't want no animation, we want all frames. Now I could pick here what part of the animation I want to actually include, but I'm going to send all of them over. Just hit OK, and it asks you where do you want to put them. I'm going to put Jazz Dance Lewis here in this sequences here, and I'll say no hair, and we'll save it there. And it'll take a while here as Cinema 4D saves them out, so let's blow through these pretty quick. I'll come back to you in After Effects when it's done. We're doing things a little bit differently. So instead of a brightly lit club scene, we've got this kind of spooky, dark abandoned scene. Yeah, we're gonna have the same technique, but a bit of a different look. And so we've got the room, and we've got Trapcode Particular here. I'm gonna hop into the designer. First things first, I want to work on the actual motion of the particles as they're falling down and bouncing off our ground. Now, I'm going to take the opportunity here to give you a little bit of a quick tip for working with turbulence in any particle system. First, I'll make this look more like a 3D model by changing the emitter to spherical, making more particles per second here, and let's turn the velocity down. And let's give it some color, just over X for now. And environment, we need some gravity, make them fall down, somewhere in the vicinity of 1,000 or so. Some movement by the turbulence. And now you'll see it's kind of messy. You can't really see all the details in that turbulence. And that's the case with any particle simulation. When you've got a bunch of particles in a big blob, the turbulence kind of gets lost in the mix. But if I take this emitter and let's say make it a lot smaller up and down and back and forth and just have it kind of wide and thin, you have a lot more detail. You can see, move this emitter up just a touch to kind of see it falling better. You get to see a lot more of that detail in that motion. Speaking of that motion, I think I'm going to make a little bit smaller and animate a little bit faster. The higher number on the scale means the detail in the turbulence gets a little smaller. Let's make the particles a lot smaller, maybe like 1.1.5 or so, and significantly more of them. Let's do about 10,000 for now. And let's do some randomness on the size. And you know what? Over life, let's make it, let's use this offset slope down. And the life, they don't need to live too long, maybe 1.5 seconds, with some randomness there as well. And then, of course, we need them to bounce. So let's enable bounce. And now we've got the opportunity to put a ground plane right here in the designer. Let's make it coming out of an actual 3D model now, instead of just a sphere. So we'll switch it to 3D model, and we need to reset the size here back to our defaults, and we'll just make it all linked, because we're not going to need to skew that around. And we'll make it come from the faces, and we'll choose our model. Now, when you first hit choose model, you'll see there's a bunch of models preloaded in here. Some made from Cinema 4D, some OBJs that are already loaded in here, and some even nice ones from the Pixel Lab. But we We're going to add in our own down here at the bottom in the custom section. You'll see some you can add. And here we hit add new model and we'll browse where we saved our sequences. And we'll choose the first frame in our OBJ sequence and hit open. Now, don't panic if it takes a second to load in. It's in this case loading 170 OBJs here into the little preview. So it's okay if it takes a minute. When you hit OK, it will also act a little funky and screwy up here. But again, that's okay. It's loading 170 OBJs into the designer. So while we wait for that to happen, let's adjust some of these settings here. We can reset the position back to the middle there. And some of those are already loaded in. I think he's kicking the wrong way. Yep, he's kicking away from us. So we'll tick invert Z, and that gets the model kicking the direction we want it to. Now again, you might be looking at this and going, wow, Particular is running really slow with this 3D model. But again, it's still loading those. It loaded them into the preview window. Now it's loading all of them into the designer. And once it happens, look, nice and fast. Now let's adjust the color over Y. And again, instead of the cool pink to blue thing we had going on with that club scene in the original, we're copying here. Let's make this kind of more of a spooky green to yellow kind of color. Fairly desaturated, I think. And yeah, yellow to green. Again, fairly desaturated there on the green. And now a very new feature is the option to choose different gradient interpolations, how it goes from one color chip to the other through the color wheel. And I think I'm liking Lab for this. Now we could definitely do with some more particles per second, so I'm going to do 20,000. And start over and look at that. Nice. Pretty good. Particles, let's make them about 50% opacity, and we'll make them additive. Well, screen. We'll make them screen with each other. That's pretty good. But these are the particles that are going to be forming the main core of our dancer. So we're actually going to keyframe their life from, let's say, point 1. So they'll be the body of the dancer, and then at the point when it fall apart, we'll keyframe the life of the particles up to about 2 seconds. But I think we can still do with more particles. Let's do 100,000. We could make a new system, but I am going to duplicate this one so we can keep a lot of these same settings here. Now, we don't need to mess with the simulation settings on this second one here. Let me turn off the main one, because any changes we make to the simulation up here will ripple down when we get rid of this block. So this will still bounce. Let's show it off by making them last a little bit longer. Again, 1.2 seconds of their life, which might be good. So they are falling down. And you know what? Let's give them a little less gravity, since these are kind of more of the dusty ones. And let's make some wind come towards the camera here, and we'll move the turbulence with the wind some. Maybe a little bit more wind there. Do you know our primary system should probably get a little bit of wind as well? Not that much, just a little bit, and we'll move the turbulence with the wind. Speaking of turbulence, I think we could make this system have a little bit less going on there on the scale and on the speed, because we've got the kind of the dust, and then we'll have our main system kind of here in the middle that this dust is falling from. And I think I'll make the size of these maybe even smaller, 0.8. I'll give it a nice, more dusty feel. There we go. Now you can see that our bouncy particles are bouncing off of here. So let's get to our floor plane and move this bounce plane up some. Height, let's try 45, see how that goes. Losing any particles below it? We are. Let's try 48 and check. There we go. No particles are getting lost down below it. So that should be pretty good. We got that bouncing right there on the floor. Perfect. Strength up a bit, randomness up a bit, and we'll give it a little bit less friction when it's sliding on the ground. Yeah, I like how that's going. All right, we'll hit apply. Let's go to our global controls, because I don't want frame 0 to have nothing. So let's add maybe 1.2 seconds to our pre-run, which means we'll have stuff happening right here from frame 1. now we need to decide exactly when he's going to fall apart. I think the third kick is probably where we want to go. So he'll go kick 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, right there is when I think we want him to fall apart. So make sure we have all systems showing. And we will go to second emitter when we will keyframe the particles per second from their nice big number. We're going to keyframe them down. And on our main system, we're going to do the same, but we're also going to keyframe the lifespan of the particles. Hit U to reveal all of our keyframes, and plus to zoom in, just have a little closer look. Now I want the life of these main particles to jump up to around 2 seconds or so, right before it stops emitting. So it'll be 1.2 seconds, then immediately 2 seconds, and then right after, on the very next frame, we'll have no particles per second from either system. There we go, bump, 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 and he falls apart. I think we still might need a few more particles on our main system, so I'm going to bump up that particles per second on the main system to something like maybe 200,000 particles per second. That's better. Now, next step is to get a nice reflection underneath our little dancer here. There's a number of ways we could do it. One way you could do it is by going to Effect, Red Giant VFX, and go to Reflection. And that gives you a very nice little reflection thing there. You can mess with the softness of it. You can use layers to give it displacement and whatnot. But because the camera is going to be moving here and we're going to have kind of a flat, kind of deep section of particles down here at the bottom, this is probably not our best tool to use, but I didn't want to forget it was there. Probably the best way to do this would be just to duplicate this layer, and we will call this one Particular Reflection. We'll put it below our main system, and then we will go into our global controls, world transform, and we'll just flip it upside down. So we'll flip it by 180 on the Y and the Z. Then our world offset will probably be about 540 or so on the Y. Might be a little too far. Let's try 520. Kind of get them flat on each other. 530 maybe. And so there we go. Now we've got a lovely reflection. Now you might say that doesn't look that much like a reflection. That's true. We're going to use compound blur to really make it look like it's blending in with the scene here. And you'll see how that works in a second. I'll grab this concrete here. Nice little concrete displacement map here. Now I'm going to want this to be running horizontally instead of vertically. So I'm going to add the transform effect real quick and just rotate it 90 degrees. And let's make this a 3D layer, and we will rotate it on the X 90 degrees so it's a nice flat floor, and we'll move its position down to about where the floor should be. Forward a little bit so we can cover this front bit here. There's not going to be any particles back there for it to reflect. Now we're going to need this layer to be in this position, but these 2D layers and the 2D effect that's going to be applied to them will not recognize the 3D transforms of this layer. So we are going to need to pre-compose this layer. We will call it reflection map, or maybe if you prefer blur map. And we'll move all attributes into the new composition. Now let me solo this to show you something. As you can see, this is now considered a 2D layer, but if I hit this collapse transformation switch, it will actually understand the position of this layer in the 3D space as it's set up in the pre-comp. That means I can add a camera in this comp here. That's probably a 35mm camera for this scene, I think. And if I move this camera in this scene up and down, you see that layer is reflecting its 3D space like it should, and in the pre-comp it's still where it was positioned. So it's working nicely, the way we want it to. Speaking of getting this working the way we want it to, let's make it happen on the reflection. For our reflection layer, we will add the compound blur effect. And we will reference the blur map and crank the value up nicely. And you can see we've got some nice texture showing up, and it looks like it's reflecting this floor. I'm looking at this floor, and I'm thinking that's not quite got the detail I want. I'm going to pop back into the blur map and add a levels effect. Bring the black point in almost all the way. And then black is where there's going to be no blur. And then white is going to be where there's full blur. You can crush that white up, and I'm going to make the black just a little less than fully black, so there's never no reflection. And there we go. Looking good. Might be a little too heavy-handed on that blur. We'll back it off just a touch. There we go. Now I want it to be a little bit less blurred right here. So on the blur map, I'm going to apply Universe Gradient Ramp. The reason I'm picking this is because it has built-in blend modes. I can just say, hey, you're going to multiply. So there'll be no blurring up there. We'll kind of pull it forward just a little bit. And we'll set that color to be, again, not all the way black. Have a look. Much nicer. Now we need to make this background look like it's moving with the dancer when we move this camera. And while we're doing this animation, I'm going to turn off the reflection so we don't have to render it. And in particular, our main system here, I'm going to say don't render all those particles. If we go into rendering, we can say just render maybe 10% of the particles. That way things move a little quicker while we're just getting our camera move set down. And I should also point out, you can crank that over 100 too. If you kind of like how things are looking but you want more particles, you can always bump that number up. Anyway, we're going to take our room here and make it a 3D layer. We will push it back quite a distance into our scene, and we'll scale it up. And maybe move it down just a skosh. So that floor here kind of feels like it matches up with what the floors we've got going here. And then let's do some camera animation. So we'll rotate it maybe 10 degrees. Beginning, set a keyframe, and we'll go to the end and we'll probably rotate it minus 15 degrees. Nice dynamic movement here. And let's check with the exposure up because it gets pretty dark here. And yeah, it looks like we're pretty good. I'm not gonna run out of layer. Nice, nice. And then I think we'll start with our camera up a little closer. Kind of right on our dancer. We'll start here. We'll pull back some. Here. Right about back to where we were. Move a little further. And then we'll zoom past our sparkles here. Past our dust here on the floor. Maybe just a little further. I like that, and we'll just slap a good old easy ease on that keyframe there. You know what? I think we can stand to go quite a bit further forward here. Looking pretty good. So we'll go back down to the bottom of our render settings here and put them back on 100% of those, and we'll turn back on our reflection. I think things are looking pretty good here. We're definitely going to want some motion blur on our particles, and it's definitely time for some color correction. I'll add an adjustment layer here to our scene, and I'll apply Magic Glow Lux to it. But before I do that, particles like this, I always feel like they should have a bit of a glow to them. What better way to get a glow than with Optical Glow? We probably don't need it to be quite that bright. So I'll crank the size up to 300 and maybe the amount maybe to 3. Just have a nice kind of subtle glow to the whole thing. Yes, I'm loving that. And maybe our room could do with a bit more saturation on it. Pull in some colors here. Maybe we'll swing the hue to green some. There we go. That's feeling better. You can see the light is coming from the left side of the screen here with these columns, and since I kind of want a little bit more of a kind of a glowy, hazy look to the scene, I want to have it look like there's some light coming from over there. So I'm going to add a light to our scene. Layer new light, spotlight. I'll make it kind of a yellowy green color, just a little touch. and I'll hit OK. Now you'll notice things go a little screwy. Our blur map here, we need to say hit AA to reveal its 3D properties, and we'll say don't accept lights. And we will tell our room, AA, don't accept lights. That way they won't get all black from having this light over here on the side that we're about to put in here. And for our light, let's put it, say, way off to the side here. We'll just have a look at just the room for now. I think we'll make this spotlight maybe a bit tighter on its cone angle. And we will use a black solid. And to this solid, we will apply Trapcode Lux. And we'll say, hey, you can reach a little further and you're a little more intense. And you know what? That spotlight needs to be angled up a bit. And I think I'll make it a little smaller of a cone angle on there. And probably bump that intensity up as well. I think I need to make the light a little bluer. There we go. I'll name this layer Lux and give it a color. You know what? Our room doesn't have a color. Our room needs a color too. There we go. Here at Magic Bullet Looks, I'm always use Renoiser. It's a great film grain emulator. I'm going to pick for this one, since this is a fairly modern looking thing, I'm going to go with modern 35mm film grain. And you can see, no grain, yes grain. You've got all kinds of lovely settings here for the amount in each channel and the size in each channel and how much you get grain in the highlights and the midtones and everything else. It's very handy. And I'm also going to get some halation, which is what happens with film as the light bounces off the back of the film. And again, choose Modern 35 for that, and maybe a little touch of Mojo. Not too much. Back down on the Mojo amount, just a little bit there. And I think just a little bit of optical diffusion just to kind of really help haze the scene out. And I'll use one of these presets that's built off of real world film filters. I think I'll use Glimmer Glass Full. Yeah, just a real subtle touch of diffusion kind of over everything. And I definitely want to have some lens distortion. This will help everything feel like it's all shot with the same camera. As the camera moves through the scene, we'll get this lens distortion on here. That'll really help sell that everything's kind of all part of the same thing. And might do some, just the tiniest touch of chromatic aberration. I'm talking just little small amounts on this one. Again, that's pretty good. We want to make it look like the camera is trying to focus right here on this. So the background needs to be a little bit out of focus. But since this is all a flat plane, not a real 3D scene, we are going to have to find some way to make this part be out of focus and this part be more in focus. And an easy way to do that would be using the compound blur, but an even easier way than that would be using spot blur from Universe. Spot blur from Universe is a compound blur. It's just driven by the gradient shape determined here. So we'll say we want a rectangle. We want it to be nice and wide and fairly tall. Not that tall. With probably a full feather. And we'll move it up. So the top part is definitely out of focus. Probably don't make it that high. Oop. And then we'll just make it go right there. Top is definitely out of focus. Bottom is in focus. Now, so the furthest it gets, we want it to be 20. The closer, we want it to be 40. So it's more out of focus. It comes more into focus here. And then it'll come maybe 50. And that'll really help it feel like this is part of the 3D scene altogether. So there you go. Look at it. It's gorgeous. Take this and make it your own. We started with Roland's great example, which is gorgeous. Now do your own thing with it. Put it in video with a motion tracked camera and use the video to drive the reflection. The possibilities are endless.